Kind of suggest a rule of thumb. Maybe we ought to limit ourselves to one nuclear crisis at a time. I know that's a radical point of view, but one's probably enough.
U.S.-China, is it a trade war? U.S.-Syria, are we ending war? And Israel-Palestine, it's a forever war. It's your GZERO world. I'm Ian Bremmer, and we are here in downtown New York City. Spring is not quite sprung, but we're getting there. I can feel it. It's a great show for you this week. We've got Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, going to talk about life's rich tapestry, a global environment. He's getting much more pessimistic about the Trump administration, lots of other things. Got your puppet regime, of course. It's a global conversation of key world leaders. We've got some secret footage coming your way. And finally, a shameless plug, my 10th book, I can't even believe it, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, coming out in just a few weeks. We'll be talking about it then, but if you want to buy it, you certainly can now. And now, your world this week. The Americans announced big tariffs against the Chinese. The markets went down, then they went back up. The Chinese announced big tariffs against the Americans. Markets went down, then they went up. Is this reversion to the mean? Are these people buying the dip? No. What it really is understanding that the headline is not implementation of tariffs. Everyone's talking trade war. In reality, it's trade war posturing. The United States has a much larger economy than the Chinese. They think that if they say some tough things, the Chinese are going to back down. The Chinese have stronger political strategy. They've got Xi Jinping. He can implement everything. They've got no rule of law. They think that they can back the Americans down. We'll see who wins. Key thing to watch this weekend, Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Bao Forum, which is their sort of version of Davos. Is he going to start talking negotiation, a willingness to engage with the Americans? But the key thing to recognize here is it's a couple of months before the Americans announce which tariffs and how much they're going to actually implement. After the corporations come back and say it's going to hurt us, we need to whittle it down, the Chinese engage, we are very far from seeing what these tariffs actually mean. U.S.-China relations are clearly getting worse. There are a lot of people that want the Americans to hit China around Trump, certainly his advisors, but that doesn't mean he wants to take a big economic hit himself. If there's one thing Trump pays attention to, it's how the markets react to what he says. And now to the Middle East, most specifically Syria, where the United States has still some 2,000 troops on the ground, but maybe not a mission. President Trump says he wants them out. The United States has basically destroyed ISIS and its caliphate, but the Pentagon says no, they should still be there. Why should they still be there? I mean, after the caliphate is destroyed, the United States doesn't really know what it's doing. It's kind of supporting the Kurds, but not really. Most of the Kurds are already moving to fight the Turks at this point. You've got Bashar Assad. He's already there. He's basically won. The country's been destroyed. You've got some 5 million refugees, over 500,000 dead. That was all done while the Americans decided not to act. It's a little late now. 2,000 troops isn't all that much, but I swear it is for the families of those that are actually there. I completely understand why Trump wants to remove this as an issue, especially because if Trump decides that he wants to go after Assad for chemical weapons, and the Russians have already said that they will hit back, do you really want those American troops on the ground as potential targets for the Russians? I would say you don't. I think Trump's on the right side of this one, and I suspect he's going to get his way over Secretary of Defense Mattis. And now to Israel-Palestine, which is never a good news story, but it's a worse news story than usual this week. We had big demonstrations from Gaza, the most economically depressed portion of the Palestinian population, massively frustrated, led by Hamas, militants against Israel coming right up to the border. Israel has an exclusion zone, a buffer. They have rules of operation, and everyone knows if anyone comes into that zone, they will use tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition. Some of the militants tried to breach the border, a couple with assault weapons. The Israeli Defense Forces shot to kill and killed. Others that were killed running away, young, some of them children, and unarmed. There are no good outcomes here. There's no good story. People pointing the finger both ways. But the clear point is that the ability of the Palestinians to threaten Israel is virtually zero. The Israelis have them very effectively walled off. They're actually building a border wall underneath the actual territory, including sensors, 3 concrete factories along the line. If you're Palestinian, the ability to force the Israelis or really anyone in the world to pay attention and take up your cause at this point is almost zero.
Sup, losers? Just middling at the crib, lol. Lol as f***, really. Very, very bad. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? How do I make this to work?
Whoa! Anyone here wanna cry? Raffle
This guy. Can't wait to grab you by the pussy and make him.
Oh, you so disarming. But I'm not though.
Ha! Rocket Man for the win!
Hey folks, Ian here.
This is not like how many warheads on how many launchers.
And I'm here at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City with its president, Richard Haass. He's just come out with the paperback version of a fantastic book, A World in Disarray. He was head of policy planning, the Bush administration, on Morning Joe all the time, and just a fantastic guy. I really love talking with him about global issues. Richard, great to be with you today.
Great to be with you, sir.
I want to start by framing it with what has been, I think, your most viral tweet ever. Is that true?
Actually, yes.
You said real Donald Trump is now set for war on three fronts: political versus Bob Mueller, economic versus China and others, allies on trade, and actual versus Iran and or North Korea. This is the most perilous moment in modern American history and has been largely brought out by ourselves, not by events. You've been around for a long time, seen decades of administrations. How alarmed do you think we should really be?
When I did the tweet, got a little bit of pushback, and some people say this is exaggeration, this is hyperbole, and they put forward some other times in quote-unquote modern history that they thought were worse. One was the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then I remind people that was simply us and the Soviet Union. We had the XCOM, the way Kennedy organized the U.S. government was really exquisite, for good reason. It's a case study. Even the Soviet Union at that point had institutional leadership. So it was just one thing going on, two very organized political entities. This is something qualitatively different. This administration's been accused of many things, but being organized is probably not one of them. The closer parallel is in some ways, I think, to the early 70s, to the Nixon administration. You had Vietnam as well as the crisis in the Middle East, the October War. You obviously had Watergate, and you had all sorts of economic problems. I can't sit here with any confidence about what's going to happen, or that somehow it's quote-unquote all going to turn out all right. I'll be honest with you, I don't feel that.
So let's hit these three and start with the Mueller investigation. Have you been surprised, honestly surprised, by the response of the Republican leadership in Congress to be as aligned with Trump on this as they seem to have been?
Surprise is probably not the operative word, disappointed. I see all these people in Congress turning the other way. Essentially, the rough word would be enablers, but I don't think it's too rough because they're too tolerant. I don't see people, all it would take is a handful of senators to challenge this administration in the Senate. I don't see them doing that. The House is not challenging him hardly at all. Where are people speaking out on a regular basis? Where are they holding this administration to account? Too many Republicans, and it hurts me to say it, seem more worried about getting primaried, about getting challenged by their own political base than they do to stand up for the larger public good. And I actually think this risks the future of the Republican Party. That you can say that's good, you can say that bad, but we've had a two-party system for better and more for better than for worse for much of our political history. And I actually think Republicans are putting that in jeopardy.
Now, you know these senators. I mean, when you talk to them about these issues and you're saying, you think it's a much bigger, much more structural issue that they are risking, what's the response? Because they're not stupid people.
No, I think they feel basically that if they take this administration on publicly, they'll lose any ability to influence it. They don't like talking about the political challenges they might face at home, but obviously, they're grown-ups, they're aware of that. But many of them feel it would be futile to do it, F-U-T-I-L-E, to do it. And they'd lose whatever little influence they have. I don't buy it, but I think that's what they believe.
To link this with Russia, why do you think Trump has been so surprisingly unwilling to criticize Putin directly?
I've seen all the speculation. I tend not to do a lot of speculation myself. It's just not my style. I don't know, but I can't justify it on strategic terms. Let me put it that way.
It does not make sense to you.
It does not make sense to me. And look, just to be fair to the administration, in a couple of cases, they've done some things towards Russia that I approve of. Just recently, finally, they stood up on the poison, the attempted murder of the Russian, the former agent, whatever you want to call it, in Britain.
In the UK.
In the UK, I wish our response had been tougher, but at least it was a response. Unlike the Obama administration, this administration decided to give lethal weaponry to Ukraine, which I thought was a step in the right direction. But the general unwillingness of the president, despite what the intelligence community is saying, despite the evidence, to stand up to Russian interference in our political process is, to me, it's inexplicable. And so then it forces people down the rabbit hole of speculation.
Okay, let's move to another one, North Korea. So I've been a little more, I want to say optimistic, but a little less concerned than you have. Last time we talked, I think I got you down to 30% likelihood of military strikes from 50. I felt good about that.
There you go.
Where are you right now? What do you think the timing potentially is of this either getting really bad or okay? You think this meeting is going to happen?
I'm actually probably an outlier here. I do think the meeting's going to happen. I believe that it's so tempting for this president to have this meeting, and it may also be tempting for his North Korean counterpart to have this meeting. So I believe even it'll happen, despite what the traditional foreign policy hands like me would say. You never want to have a summit unless it's really carefully prepared. You've minimized the chance for surprise or uncertainty. My hunch is both of these guys, for very different reasons, want a summit. So I think the odds are better than even that happens. The danger in the summit is twofold. One is that we're too anxious for a deal, and we put on the table all sorts of things that would threaten our alliance relationships out there and the rest. The other is that the summit happens, it's a fiasco, and people then say, well, we tried diplomacy. That didn't work. Now let's flip the switch and go to something. Now we have to use military force. So to me, it's the danger. Again, I admit it. I'm a traditionalist. That's why I am in some ways where I am. But I worry about this kind of a roll of the dice. I've never quite seen anything like it.
On Iran, the roll of the dice being, are we or are we not going to rip up a deal that we put together by ourselves?
Quite possibly we will, which again I do not understand. Look, I've been critical of the Iran deal from the get-go. I do think the sunset provisions on key parts of the agreement are misguided.
10 years. Yeah.
I think we made the cardinal error of wanting an agreement too much. That said, this is the agreement we got. And at this point, I would focus on other things that Iran is doing beyond the agreement, whether their missile program, more important, their imperial reach around the region. I would focus on those things. This gives us another 7.5, and in many ways longer than that, 10 years, 15 years, to see what happens in Iran domestically, to emphasize a follow-on agreement, which actually in the book you were kind enough to mention I argue for. I think what we should do is sit down and say, look, these ought to be open-ended. Why aren't these limits open-ended? Why should Iran be able to accumulate all the prerequisites of a serious nuclear weapons program under this agreement? They shouldn't be able to. So that's something we should press for. But the way the administration is going about it will make it impossible to get that. We do not need a near-term crisis over this. And can I just kind of suggest a rule of thumb? Maybe we ought to limit ourselves to one nuclear crisis at a time. I know that's a radical point of view, but one's probably enough. There is no good case for breaking this agreement. Now, it's not, we are not better off as a result. We ought to be thinking again, how do we lock it in for the long term, not how do we undo it in the short term?
Yeah, harder to do that if you're transactional and short term in policy orientations. Right?
Exactly right. And it's the reason, and probably bring us to our next topic, that you have a National Security Council. The whole idea is to see things in the whole, to take a step back, to see the trade-offs. Do you press this or that government on X if you've also got to work with them on Y and Z? How do you work different issues at the same time? If you do this on Iran, how might it affect your ability to deal with North Korea or vice versa? One of the reasons you bring everybody together through a national security process is to see trade-offs. If you look at every issue in isolation, if you look at everything as a transaction, you're not thinking about relationships, you're not thinking about trade-offs, you're not thinking about precedents. That is really a dangerous way to go about national security policy.
So at least we'll finally have the person in that position that you know can get it done in John Bolton.
I knew you were going.
The media's gone a little nuts about his appointment. He's only one guy. What's he like? What's he going to be like?
First of all, he's more than just one guy. That position is extraordinarily influential. You know, the Secretary of Defense has to worry about hundreds of thousands of people in uniform, far-flung operations. Secretary of State's on the road a lot. The National Security Advisor is about 25 feet down the hall. He has more interaction with the president probably than any other person, maybe the chief of staff. But those two more than anybody else. This is a president also who didn't come into the office, shall we say, with a rich reservoir of background on these issues. So this is an influential person. John Bolton, the problem is, I think his judgment, shall we say, his track record ain't great. Big advocate of the 2003 Iraq War. Even in retrospect, he thinks it was good. He does want to tear up the Iran agreement. He made what I thought was an intellectually weak, to say the least, disingenuous argument to justify what he called preemptive attacks on North Korea, confusing that with the so-called preventive attack at the risk of boring everybody out there. But he argued that the threat was imminent. Well, I think there's questions about judgment, and there's questions about temperament. You know, my time at the State Department, John, shall we say, was rather controversial in how we used intelligence and how we reacted to reports or findings from subordinates that didn't comport with what he wanted. Well, this job, that's what you've got to do. I spent 4 years when I worked for Bush 41. I was on the National Security Council staff, and I worked with, I believe, the best national security advisor we've ever had, Brent Scowcroft.
Yeah.
And the reason was that Brent understood that your role as someone who dispensed due process, who made sure the system worked, that the president got what he needed to hear, not necessarily what he wanted to hear, and not necessarily what Brent agreed with. Brent understood that his principal role, his principal hat, was to ensure that the process was intellectually and politically fair and complete. Only secondarily would he offer his own personal views, and he would never let his personal preferences get in the way of what he thought was his obligation to the system. I haven't seen in John Bolton a willingness to do that. Now, can people grow in jobs? Sure. Would I like him to grow in this job? Absolutely, because he's going to have extraordinary influence. But that, to me, is a big question mark. The real question, I think, is Mike Pompeo, how he acts in this job. And, he's got some advantages Rex Tillerson did not have. He has a close relationship with this president, as close as anyone seems to have.
He's good with Congress.
Very good with Congress, given his own background. He's now experienced with a lot of the issues, was at West Point, so he knows this stuff. And so the question is, now that he's Secretary of State, which is the ultimate insider, as opposed to being on the old adage, where you stand depends upon where you sit. Where does Mike Pompeo come? Because in many cases he could be decisive here. And I think I know a lot of people are writing him off based on my own personal experience with him. That's a mistake, and I would watch that space. And I am hoping that in many cases he is able to forge approaches and coalitions with people like Mattis and others that would be quite reasonable.
So the one place we haven't gotten to yet are the economic relations, trade relations. A lot of pushing against American allies, though so far implementation's spotty. A lot more pushing on China, implementation to be seen. Well, do you feel a little bit more, of the three, do you feel more optimistic or more benignly towards this?
Well, so far, at least you're right, that when it came to the steel and aluminum tariffs, and then also with the China rhetoric, the reality has been a little bit more muted. With China, we're now finally having the kind of talks we should have had. With the exceptions with the allies, by and large, a good thing. So we'll see.
It is interesting that they've come back in recent weeks and talked a little more about maybe leaving the TPP was not such a great idea.
Beginning to see that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, commonly called the TPP, was not just a smart economic plan to wire the United States and 11 other countries representing, over 40% of the world's economy, but strategically. It was big. It was a great way, I guess you'd call it geoeconomics, linking countries economically who are also linked strategically. And it would have been a much better way, for example, to confront China. If we have issues with Chinese trade behavior, much better to force China to raise its game, to play by rules we and the other 11 could have set. But when we took ourselves out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership about just over a year ago, actually it was in the first week of the Trump presidency, the president gave away unilaterally a powerful tool, not just to help the American economy, but to in some ways curb certain Chinese trading behavior as well as Chinese strategic assertiveness.
Now, the reason your tweet was so compelling, of course, is not because of these individual issues, but the fact that they all come together in one administration, they come together in one unwinding world order, and they compound the challenges for each other.
And they're largely self-created. It's one thing to get up and you have foreign armies moving places and so forth. What's so interesting about this is how many of these things have come from within. And that's one of the great ironies of this administration, I guess I'd say. Again, coming back to where we began, when Donald Trump came into office, his inbox was daunting. You can't choose your inbox. Your inbox chooses you. This would have greeted Hillary Clinton or anybody else. It was tough. North Korea and any number of other issues, what was going on in Europe because of Russia, an unraveling Middle East, a collapsing Venezuela. This administration, though, has not been content with that. What it's done is basically every day added to the inbox. And so much of this is self-generated. And so they've taken a difficult situation and they've made it several times worse. And that's where we are. And it's hard to feel comfortable about an administration that's so anti-process and looks at things so separately, given our conversation, doesn't see the connections, tends not to think about relationships and so forth, sees these things in isolation. It's got to worry you, and that's without getting into the conspiracy thinking about how, some people would suggest one might might push a crisis in one area in order to help distract from a crisis in another.
Dog scenario.
Without going there.
Yeah, don't need to go there.
Don't need to go there.
But by itself, the geopolitical environment we're seeing today, you would consider the most dangerous of your professional career?
It is, and something I never thought I'd say, because my first half of my career was in the Cold War. I served at the Pentagon in the 70s, the State Department in the 80s, and grew up in that world. And then for the last 25 years, it's been somewhat different, and some of our biggest problems were actually, again, self-created, like 2003 and the war there. But what worries me now is just you've got so many things going on at once. You've got globalization, which in many of its forms we haven't even begun to cope with, whether it's cyber or other places. You've got so many actors, state and non-state alike, who can make a real difference and often anything but benign. You've got a United States where there's no political consensus about what it is we ought to be doing. We've made ourselves vulnerable in certain ways, the enormous accumulation of debt. I am worried about where we are. And when I always feel it's the foreign policy equivalent at times, this administration of healthcare policy, where you had a repeal but no replace. I feel every once in a while when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to a lot of things, they're repealing a lot of the arrangements they inherited, but it's not clear what they're replacing with. And that in a nutshell is why I'm so worried.
Is China, Xi Jinping, and his stability and strength, the hope at the bottom of Pandora's box? I mean, what is, in that environment, where are you looking for light?
Well, something you and I would agree on. You called it a GZERO world. I call it a world in disarray. I would think that the alternative to what has been a largely U.S.-led world order for 3/4 of a century is going to be much more world disorder, in which there's not going to be a clear leader. China doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the mindset, doesn't have the habits, doesn't have the incentive to do this. So this idea that China is going to replace us is, to me, shows a real misunderstanding of China and what the requirements are to be a world leader. We've abdicated. That's what's so odd. I'm used to countries getting exhausted by the role. You saw that, say, with Britain a century ago. I'm used to countries getting weakened by it. In the case of the Soviet Union, Soviet Union was kind of the example of Paul Kennedy, overreach and what happens. The idea that a great power would simply basically wake up and say, we don't really want to do this anymore. We've kind of had it with this role. We want to go do something else. That's what we've done. We've abdicated without a clear alternative. And to me, it betrays a real lack of understanding about how the world affects us and how this world has benefited us. But that's this president's mindset. He really does believe that, on balance, the burdens of American world leadership are far greater and the costs are far greater than any benefits. He thinks our trade relationships, to use an elegant word, have screwed us more than they've helped us. So he gets up and he actually wants to undo a lot of these things. And that is his mindset. And that, again, is what worries me.
Richard Haass, great to be with you.
Ian Bremmer, great to be with you.
That's your show this week. Come back next week. We've got Moises Naim, the former Minister of Trade for Venezuela, now distinguished fellow at Carnegie and head of Afeto Naim. He's going to talk about Venezuela and South America and all sorts of things that you want to know about. Be with you next week.